In this podcast, we're going to be looking at the contribution of Marxist theories to our understanding of the process of development in the world today. So there are three different strands of Marxist theory. You've got the traditional Marxists that look at trade and development, world systems theory that argues that the world consists of a single united capitalist class, and dependency theory that argues that developing countries are exploited. So if we look at Marxist theory and how they see trade, they look at trade and the link to underdevelopment. They argue that during the time of slavery, people were taken from developing countries in the form of human resources for use by Western exploiters. The developing world was then forced into underdevelopment because of the human cost of slavery. Then, during the colonial times, raw materials were taken out of the developing country, meaning that even if a developing country wanted to develop, they couldn't because they haven't got the foundations of raw materials and the scars left from the slave trade and colonialism. For example, because of colonial powers controlling the government, the country hasn't had that long to build a strong, sustainable government of its own, which explains why some countries aren't developed today. So, today we can see that countries without natural resources are forced to make cash crops to make up for this, which don't offer much in the way of development, and developing countries suffer from climate change. Okay, so we can evaluate the Marxist theory because it's useful, as it explains why some countries can't develop now, and it explains why there are conflict relationships between some countries in the colonial period of exploitation. Marxist theory also recognises the external factors for underdevelopment, unlike modernization theory that does not recognise the colonial past or exploitative relationships. However, the problem with Marxist theory is that colonialism is outdated and exaggerated. It could be that at the time of writing this theory provided an accurate description of the current state of development, but now some LEDCs are developing very rapidly and it seems to be inaccurate. Also, neoliberals would argue that it is not the scars of colonialism that have led to cash crops because of lack of resources, but instead the countries have realised that their comparative advantage, so they need to specialise in cash crops as they are best at it, like MEDCs are best at high-tech industries. However, the problem with neoliberalism is this doesn't work because MEDCs focus on high-tech industries but keep their domestic market of farmers and have protectionist policies, which mean that even if LEDCs specialise in agriculture, they cannot compete on the international market because MEDC's domestic markets are so subsidised. Also, Marxist theory creates a two-tier system. MEDCs have high-paid manufacturing industries, whilst LEDCs get the low-paid income agriculture, which means they cannot develop. And Marxist theory doesn't offer a solution to the exploitative nature leading to underdevelopment. Another Marxist-inspired theory that focuses on trade is world systems theory. Wallerstein believes that the trade dynamic becomes exploitative because there are three tiers of trade in the world. Trade from the core nations like the USA exploits trade from the semi-periphery countries like China, which then in turn exploits trade from the underdeveloped periphery nations like Vietnam or Sub-Saharan Africa. The core nations trade in finance, the periphery nations trade in raw materials, and the semi-periphery are somewhere in between. Overall, world systems theory is useful because it can help explain the changing nature of exploitative relationships across the globe. For instance, it gives an understanding of how developing nations like China could exploit another developing nation, which wouldn't be explained by dependency theory. Also, world systems theory explains how nations can swap economic divisions of labour. For instance, if the main industry in the core nation fell, then the semi-periphery would take up their place on a new core nation would exploit the new semi-periphery. Some sociologists even predict that the UK is slipping into the semi-periphery. So now we move on to dependency theory and their view of aid. They argue that aid is usually tied and it works on behalf of the rich nations and not to develop LDCs. For example, the UK provides aid to Malaysia in the form of aircrafts and technology, provided that they buy in the form of UK and use their advisors. And also, Germany benefits from Bangladesh, as Bangladesh is not wired up electrically, and a large majority of the country live without electricity. Germany sells energy to them and uses this independent relationship to tell them how to manage their energy, notably shutting down a nuclear energy proposal because it would mean that Bangladesh couldn't buy cells. This creates underdevelopment because money is not spent on what would actually help, such as infrastructure and education. Overall, dependency theory is useful as it explains the exploitative nature of aid from the West to developing countries. However, modernization theorists like Rostow argue that aid is not exploitative, but instead it is a way to promote development. Aid should be an investment into education and could come with the requirements to teach a Western model of education. However, the problem with modernization theory is that Western models are exploitative because they rely on Western values, knowledge and systems in ways which aren't of that of the recipient country and exploits them vice versa. Moreover, world system theory believe that aid is also a part of exploitation, as the semi-periphery also plays a role in exploitation alongside the core and the periphery. For example, China has built roads across Africa for transport of their goods in the form of aid, but really it is to mask over the transportation of raw materials they are taking out of the country within Africa. However, modernization theory would argue that infrastructure is a big part of development, and so if Chinese companies are building roads, then these can also be used by rural areas and indigenous people to get around. The freedom of movement promotes mobility, which can lead to moving for jobs, which can lead to development. However, dependency theory would argue that roads are just a bribe to local people, as they cover up the fact that China are taking resources which they can build their development, but without the resources they have nothing to develop on. So, in terms of war and conflict, Marxist theories would argue that there is a legacy of colonialism which has led to conflict in the world, which can prolong underdevelopment. For example, in Rwanda there is still a legacy of colonialism which has caused resentment between the native Tutsis and the Hutus, even after the colonial powers left. The conflict intensified, leaving the Rwandan genocide in 1994. War and conflict can prolong development because the population of working-age men are involved in it. Land and infrastructure can be destroyed, and even years after the conflict, unexploded bombs or landmines make life difficult. The colonial history of a country can lead to war and conflict, and this explains why there is underdevelopment in the world. However, war and conflict may arise out of a manner of reasons and not just a legacy of colonialism. So in conclusion, dependency was the most influential during the 1960s and 70s, and dependency theory has been used by leaders, social movements and political movements to advocate free thinking and an end to imperialism.